Tensions rise between the United States and Saudi Arabia after the announcement by OPEC Plus to cut global oil production. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. For weeks now, the United States has warned Saudi Arabia there will be consequences for the decision by OPEC Plus to cut oil production by 2 million barrels a day. But Saudi leaders say the decision was simply about economics, not politics. It was also endorsed by all 23 oil exporting countries, which decide how much crude oil to sell on the world market. This week, Saudi Arabia's energy minister said countries should think twice about using their oil reserves to manipulate markets.
People are depleting their emergency stocks,
Yes.
had depleted it, used it as a mechanism to manipulate markets, while its profound purpose was to mitigate shortages of supply. Be it as it may, it's everybody's choice. However, it is my profound duty to make it clear to the world that losing emergency stock may become painful in the months to come.
The criticism comes as U.S. President Biden announced his administration will release 15 million barrels of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in an effort to stabilize gasoline and diesel prices. So where does the relationship go from here, and what does it mean for geopolitics in the region? For those answers, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, is Salman al-Ansari. He's a Saudi political researcher. From Dakar, Senegal, Fadad Kaboub is an associate professor of economics at Denison University and president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University, and Jack Midgley is the principal of Midgley & Company, a consultancy advising top executives in government and commercial organizations. Jack, why don't I start with you? You heard the energy minister there, kind of ominous words. What do you make of them?
I didn't hear them as ominous at all.
You didn't?
They sounded, in fact, they sounded very reasonable to me. The purpose of emergency stockpiles is to provide emergency backup in case of a crisis. And we live in a world today where there's no shortage of crises. So I found His Royal Highness's words to be right on target. You know, these manipulations, if you'd like to call them that, in the oil market reflect sound business judgments by the OPEC Plus consortium in the face of a profound uncertainty. And we have that now with the advent of European sanctions, with continued uncertainty in Ukraine, with inflation around the world. The prudent step for OPEC Plus is to hedge against the possibility of a surplus in the market. We could very well see that if supplies are not restrained over the next few months. So this relatively small cut by OPEC Plus is a completely understandable and in context very reasonable move by the consortium. After all, OPEC's purpose is to restrict supply, to make sure that oil prices are stable and predictable. The member countries depend on that. So I see this as a crisis, if it is that, that's largely been manufactured by a failure to understand what's happening with oil prices around the world.
Okay, let me ask you this follow-up based on what you just said then, because you call it a small cut and reasonable. We're not seeing that here in Washington, D.C., as you well know. President Biden warning Saudi Arabia of consequences. We hear members of Congress saying, you know, that we should cut arms to the kingdom itself and bring American troops back. Missile systems should be cut as well. Even Anthony Blinken, who was on that trip with the U.S. president to the kingdom back in July, had some comments about this. Let's listen to what he had to say, and I want to get your reaction on the other side.
President Biden has been making clear that our goal when it comes to energy is to make sure that there is enough supply on world markets to meet demand. And particularly as we head into to winter in various places around the world, that's even more important. And so that was the lens through which we saw the OPEC decision. We think it's short-sighted, and as the president's made very clear, that decision has to have consequences, and that's something that we're reviewing as we speak.
So no U.S. administration has ever retaliated against Saudi Arabia for oil policies. Do you think the Biden administration is going to be different? And we also hear in Congress, they're in recess, but they've got this bill they're talking about, no OPEC, no oil producing and exporting cartels. There seems to be a lot of this kind of language coming from Washington, D.C.
Well, there's an election next month, and at this point, there's a lot of political hate to be made by trotting out OPEC as a punching bag. Mike, the fact is that the world's largest oil producer is the United States of America. This should not be forgotten. The second largest oil producing country in the world is Russia. U.S. policy has restricted the flow of Russian oil into the world. U.S. policy has limited the ability of U.S. Refiners to pull oil out of the ground. If this is a crisis, it's a crisis that the Americans have made. And with all due respect to Secretary Blinken, the U.S. ability to impose consequences, I think, is very limited. No one believes that weapons sales can be significantly reduced to the Saudis without tremendous impact on the profitability and revenues of the U.S. Defense industry. That won't be tolerated. And at the same time, the U.S. leverage over the Saudis is really increasingly limited. You know, the United States is not the Saudis' largest trading partner. The country that's the largest trading partner of Saudi Arabia is China. In fact, Saudi oil exports go primarily, well, they go first to China, then to Japan, then to Korea, then to India. The Americans are only the 5th largest consumer of Saudi oil. So I think we ought to put some facts on the table here and recognize that the ability of the U.S. to influence these decisions is becoming increasingly limited.
Salman, let me get your thoughts on all of this. You know, this trip back in July, we talked about it. It was seen as basically an effort for Biden to kind of repair relations with Saudi Arabia following the death of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. How is Riyadh viewing this current dust-up, if you will?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And I think when it comes to Saudi-U.S. relations, we all know that it's a historic relations. It's an 8-decade relations that is very important for the oil, not only for the oil, but for the whole security and the regional security and for economic prosperity for the whole world. But speaking about the issues that we've been having, I think numbers do not lie. Oil prices, for example, right now is the same as the prices of the pre-Russian Ukraine conflict, which means that it means OPEC Plus succeeded in stabilizing the oil market, where the U.S. basically failed to manage prices of gas, LNG, coal, and other energy resources. And the U.S. far-left narratives and policies are definitely problematic, not only to the Saudi-U.S. relations, but to the well-being of America itself. They basically waged the media, I would call it crusade, against Saudi Arabia and its leadership and its people. They tried everything in their hand to tarnish the Saudi reputation and isolate it, but all didn't succeed, and it actually backfired. Overall, I think Saudi Arabia is very committed to this relationship, but sometimes, you know, in the spirit of reciprocity, we will reciprocate in kind. So, and the U.S., I believe, has less leverage over Saudi Arabia than Saudi Arabia over the U.S. And let's not forget that Saudi Arabia is the largest trading partner for the U.S. in the Middle East and North Africa. And for the Saudis, the U.S. is the second largest trading partner after China. And I actually yesterday met the former White House communications director, Mr. Anthony Sacramento, here in Riyadh. He said it beautifully, that the Saudi-U.S. relations is a Catholic marriage, which means unbreakable, and which means both nations need each other equally. And I responded and said, let's hope it's not a Muslim marriage where divorce is easy and can be done with simply some words. But I personally think the kingdom and the U.S. will find a way through which they can get over these problems, because they are not helpful for both nations. So I'm kind of optimistic about the future, but not very optimistic about the current administration in the White House.
Let me ask you about this. You said reciprocate in kind. How do you see that working its way out?
Look, definitely, we don't want to be speculating about what the U.S. position will be with regards to the promises that he said it earlier that he will make it a pariah. Then he actually visited Saudi Arabia. Then he said like the idea of recalibration, and then he talked about reevaluating the relationship. And I said it earlier that nobody knows what these words mean. You want to reevaluate Saudi-U.S. relationship? What does that mean? Does that mean you're going to put some restraints or things that go against the Saudi interests? I don't think the U.S. will be foolish to do such big moves, because Saudi Arabia, let's not forget that at the time of Richard Nixon, he made the U.S. dollar to not be linked to gold, and he actually made it to be linked to oil. So that's why people have the idea of the petrodollar. And who holds the biggest organization, or who is heading the biggest organization of oil in the world? It is Saudi Arabia. So if you go against the interests of Saudi Arabia, you are actually going against the US dollar per se. So I don't want to go that extreme and say Saudi Arabia will do this and that, because we can't speculate about the Saudi move. But in general, Saudi Arabia has more leverage over the US than the US having leverage over Saudi Arabia. And as I said, I'm personally a big believer in the Saudi-US relations. I want it to flourish, but at the same time, I would never want the United States to be considering Saudi Arabia as a client state, because Saudi Arabia is not there to be taking side over the other. No, we are there as an equalizer between the different powers in the world.
Well, Anton, let me bring you into the discussion. We heard Jack say that this is a small cut. It's reasonable. We heard Salman saying that it's an act of stabilization. The White House, of course, as you know, framing this much differently. They're saying OPEC Plus is doing this as an act of support for Russia, which relies significantly on oil and gas revenues. How do you see this, and what's the view in Moscow?
Well, personally, I don't think that this is a question of OPEC siding with Russia. This is a question of OPEC pursuing its market interests, and I agree with Jack on this. Moscow's perspective, on the other hand, is that there is an economic war being waged against Russia. The West has decided to make energy its weapon, and so far the Russians are sitting back and watching with surprise and quite possibly a bit of glee as the caps, the proposed caps on oil prices and the attempts to sanction gas are having a much bigger negative impact on Europe, a little bit less so on the US, but certainly on Western Europe, on all of Europe, than they're actually having on Russia. So the Russian economy, although clearly impacted by the unprecedented sanctions that have been imposed on it, has done reasonably well considering the situation. But it's Western Europe that is dealing with immense repercussions. And if Plan A was to trigger an economic crisis, lead to regime change in Russia, so far, that certainly hasn't produced a result.
Fadl, do you see it that way as well, using energy as a weapon?
Well, energy has always been a weapon, but this current crisis that we're dealing with here, the Russian conflict in the Ukraine and the consequences to the global economy, is really the unfinished business of the Cold War that triggered the ultimate confrontation in the Ukraine between, indirectly, Western Europe and the US and Russia on the other hand. So to blame the current energy crisis on Saudi Arabia or OPEC in general is not reasonable. For example, when we had the energy crisis of the 70s. A country like Japan, which was highly dependent on imported oil, managed over the last several decades to diversify into heavily invest in alternative sources of energy, including nuclear, but increasingly renewables. The U.S., on the other hand, doubled down on oil and gas and fossil fuels, and that's why we're very vulnerable to these things. I mean, introducing sanctions and escalating the conflict instead of sitting down and negotiating a peace treaty and a peaceful resolution to the conflict, these sanctions are simply escalating the tensions, which means escalating the economic crisis that's induced by this conflict, not just in energy, but in terms of commodity prices overall from Russia, and food prices, given that both Russia and the Ukraine are major exporters. So really the conflict ricocheting back on the European Union and on the global South in general, which is a whole bunch of countries that are very vulnerable to energy price shocks and food price shocks. So it's unfortunate that we're trying to deal with the inflation consequences by introducing additional sanctions and additional escalation of conflict and bringing more people into the mix, including Saudi Arabia and other OPEC countries, to blame them for policy choices that the U.S. is really intensifying.
Well, let me ask you about this. The Saudis said the move was designed to basically boost the cost of oil. It had fallen below $90 a barrel from its peak back in June of $122 a barrel. You teach economics. Can you kind of give us walk us through what kind of decision this is? How are these numbers arrived at, so that the viewers have a better understanding of all of this?
Well, the concern here is that there's a lot of uncertainty in the market on all sides, and the uncertainty is about the intensification of the conflict and the potential additional sanctions and the potential introduction, apparently, of these price controls that the U.S. and the G7 in general is trying to introduce. Price controls with triggers that will involve sanctions hurting other countries who violate these price controls. And these are third-party countries beyond OPEC, we're talking about all countries. And Russia potentially retaliating with sanctions against countries that will comply with these price control sanctions that the U.S. and the G7 in general is trying to introduce. So it's a lot of the uncertainty that's rippling through the entire market, including the energy market, the oil market. And from the investor's perspective, if you add productive capacity in the oil industry, will that become a stranded asset in the next few years? In other words, will you be putting cash up front to build additional productive capacity, to pump more oil that will be facing price caps in the future and further disruptions? So this is really the uncertainty that has intensified over the last 12 months. So prices are not really reflecting normal market conditions. They're being kind of pushed up and down based on all kinds of political and geopolitical confrontations that have nothing to do with normal market conditions.
Salman, the Saudi ambassador to the United States spoke recently with CNN's Becky Anderson, and she talked about the U.S.-Saudi ties, which you've also kind of discussed here. This is what she had to say when she was asked if the kingdom would ever sever ties with the United States.
The world can't do without a relationship with the United States of America. Have no doubt, the United States is the United States. For 80 years, it has been our strategic ally. For 80 years, it has been our partner. I hear a lot of people talk about reforming or reviewing the relationship with the kingdom, and I think actually that's a positive thing. This kingdom is not the kingdom it was 5 years ago. It's not the kingdom it was 10 years ago. So every piece of analysis that existed is no longer relevant. We are a young population. We have young leadership. We have an aspiration and a goal to engage with the world in a way we never did before.
Salman, let me ask you about that. How has the kingdom changed under the leadership of the Crown Prince, and is it time to kind of review this relationship and maybe take it in a different direction?
Yeah, I think, as we all know, that Saudi Arabia has changed dramatically when it comes to its economic scene, socially, culturally, etc. And Saudi Arabia, as we all know, it's a G20 nation. It's one of the leading powers in the world economy, etc. And it's the central bank of energy. So, and to be honest, like I think the thing that the Saudis want to make sure that it is like as an idea to be delivered to the United States and to everyone is the fact that Saudi Arabia is not comfortable anymore with the idea of being framed as a country that needs to be with a specific polar over others. And if there are two polars, the Eastern and the Western, we have to know that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia sees itself as a polar by itself, even though, you know, since the word polar may have some negative connotation, I would actually use the word centricity or an equalizer, as I said. And as we know, it's the heart of the Arab Muslim world and the spiritual leader of over 1.7 billion Muslims around the globe. And speaking of Islam, there is actually a verse in the Quran that says, وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. We have made you into a nation of moderation. And that's the best model Saudi Arabia can take between the world's powers, and it will be for the benefit of all. So, and after all, I personally think that the US is somehow holding the dominance rope so tight that it starts to hurt, and that they should loosen their hand a little bit and celebrate the success of the global model that they have created by themselves. So, as I said earlier, I'm optimistic about the Saudi-US relationship in the long run, but absolutely not under the current administration in the United States, because they have been copying the same mistakes of the Obama doctrine in the Middle East by allowing Iran to wreak havoc in the region, by trying to reactivate the nuclear deal, which is a failing deal, and also by their moves to create some kind of problems in the Arab and Muslim world through extremist elements like the Muslim Brotherhood, etc., under the name of democracy and freedom of speech, etc. So I don't think Saudi Arabia will buy into these things anymore, and I think the Saudis have made their point very clear. We are here as an equalizer. We are not in a position where we're going to be against someone else in your favor. No, we're going to work to moderate and to be in the middle and to work for the Saudis, for the Saudi interest, Saudi first, and also it will definitely not be at the account of anyone. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Jack, let me ask you about what he just said. How do you see this recalibrated relationship moving forward?
That's going to continue. I think what Salman said is exactly right. We in the West, I think, often believe that Saudi Arabia's most important asset is its oil. And maybe until now that's been true. But those of us who work closely with our Saudi friends know that the real asset of Saudi Arabia is its population. The young generation in Saudi Arabia is ambitious, it is global in its outlook, it is well educated, and it is proud of its country, its faith, and its institutions, especially the institution of government. It is not a Western government. It won't ever be. And that's not the direction in which the population of Saudi Arabia is going. So this relationship will automatically calibrate. You see it today in the changes in the economic relationships of the kingdom, which used to be completely dominated by the United States and the UK, and are now increasingly global. The relationship between Saudi Arabia and China has grown to the point where His Majesty himself has said China is the most essential economic partner of Saudi Arabia. Such a statement would never have been made 5, 10, or 20 years ago. This relationship is recalibrating, and it's demographics and economics that are driving the recalibration not politics.
Anton, let me ask you about what you mentioned earlier, energy as a weapon. I was just looking at some of the statistics last year. Nearly 40% of the natural gas used to heat homes and power businesses throughout the European Union was coming from Russia. In September, that percentage dropped by half after, of course, the EU imposed sanctions against Moscow for its military operation in Ukraine. The EU is vowing to eventually stop buying Russian gas, as you know. How is Russia viewing this? How is it going to impact Russia?
Well, the Russians are already turning their gas supplies, first of all, towards the east. Second of all, they are continuing to supply Europe with gas, but now it's going through Turkey. And Erdogan and Putin have already made an announcement that they're planning on making Turkey a gas hub for Europe. So if the Europeans don't want Nord Stream 1 and 2, to function, then they're going to be buying gas that will travel a longer distance, will be more expensive. And by the way, the Russians are also supplying LNG to Europe. The Europeans are also buying Russian gas, but through China, because China doesn't have LNG of its own. That's Russian gas. So the Europeans are basically going to be paying much more for the exact same product. And while in the very long term, this is good for the planet in terms of weaning Europe off of fossil fuels. Listen, anyone who expects this to happen in 5 or even 10 years and European economies to actually survive, not deindustrialize, and not plunge the continent into poverty and chaos is living in another world. The Russians are approaching the whole energy business as a global and Eurasian market. They're integrating themselves into into the rest of the Eurasian continent, and they're doing it with stunning success, both with Saudi Arabia and with everyone in the greater Middle East and North Africa even. Moreover, one of the unintended consequences, although how the Europeans and the Americans could not have foreseen this, there are a lot of very good brains, both here and in Europe. One of the outcomes of using energy as a weapon is the de-dollarization of the global economy, both broadly, but also especially the energy economy. And the other outcome is that if the Europeans decide to impose a price cap on oil, as they're planning on doing beginning in early December, and will then decide to implement it by limiting, for example, insurance for oil transportation, then the Lloyd's market in London will begin to slowly implode as countries all over the world are going to be creating their own insurance companies. As a matter of fact, the Russians are already working on this. This is not a pipe dream. This is a reality. So it's remarkable how the quest to punish Russia now will have very negative long-term repercussions for the petrodollar, for the United States economy, and for the West more broadly.
Fadil, let me ask you about, I want to revisit what you were talking about earlier. I mean, you would think at some point, especially with the most recent reports about how all these countries are missing their targets when it comes to addressing climate change, that this might be an opportunity for people to start looking at this and saying, maybe we need to pivot to more efforts towards green energy. Why hasn't that happened, do you think?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, the last UN report, the production gap report, that's looking at how much we're planning to extract and burn by 2030 and 2040 versus how much we're allowed to extract and burn in order to meet the climate challenge. We're on track right now to extract and burn almost twice as much as we're allowed to by 2030 and almost 4 times as much by 2040. So we're doomed in terms of actually meeting the climate challenge. So accelerating the transition should be the focal point of this crisis, as opposed to sanctions and counter-sanctions and urging more countries to drill and build pipelines all the way from Nigeria, from Algeria, from Egypt, Lebanon, and Israel. Everybody's building LNG capacity and gas capacity to ship to replace the Russian oil instead of urging everybody to double down on this energy transition.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. It's been a great discussion. Really appreciate it. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.